and start. Welcome. My name is Doug Erickson. I'm head of special collections here at the college. And for the next few moments, I'll be talking to you about William Stafford. With me is my colleague, Jeremy Skinner. We both work in the library here and oversee the Stafford collection. So thank you for coming, and hopefully we'll have a nice informal conversation about kind of Stafford's legacy at the college. You know, it's interesting that the first slide I chose to put up is actually maybe the real reason that Bill Stafford ever came to Lewis and Clark. And as many of you know, with the Japanese internment into World War II of Japanese Americans, at Occidental College, there were 6 young men and women who were attending at the time. And upon the declaration that all Japanese need to be interned, Remsen Bird, who was the president of Occidental College, decided to become the advocate for those people who didn't have a voice, meaning the Japanese Americans. He felt it was important enough to advocate for Japanese Americans as individuals. He also promised that each one that was attending the school at the time would be able to come back once this internment ended, and they would be able to go the rest of their college career at Occidental, and they would, if they didn't want to come back to Occidental, he'd try to find another place for them. Now this may just seem like an aberration in history, but the reality is that Remsen Bird was the president of Occidental, yes, but also was the person who mentored Morgan Odell. Morgan Odell himself, being a World War I ambulance driver in Italy, a pacifist himself, was and also the chaplain, Methodist chaplain at Occidental, and head of the religious studies department there, and philosophy. And it was Remsen Bird who recommended Morgan Odell to become president of Lewis and Clark College. And upon his accepting of this on a 1-year appointment, because he wasn't sure that this college could actually make it, so he procured his job at Occidental for 1 more year to kind of test out the waters at Lewis and Clark. And he came from Pasadena, where he'd been born and raised, and worked on school in Chicago and his time in Italy, but for the most of his life he had spent in Southern California, Morgan Odell, and came up to Lewis and Clark with his wife Ruth. His first hire was 2 hires. The first one being Hideo Hashimoto, a Japanese intern himself, a Methodist minister himself, as Morgan, and also a professor of religion, as was Morgan, and of course a Japanese intern. Hideo had gone to Berkeley and the Union Theological Seminary, and also had been interned in Jerome, Arkansas, where he met his wife, Reiko. He was all about reconciliation, about peace, and was an instrumental member of the faculty here at the college for many decades to come after his hiring in the early 40s. When Morgan went down to Southern California to start to recruit for his new faculty, Hideo was obviously one of his first. His second was Bill Stafford. And Bill always commented that he wanted to go to a school that would hire somebody that had been a Japanese internee, and the second one being a World War II conscientious objector, in the sense of that was Stafford. They remained lifelong friends and were involved in the peace movement here and across the country as colleagues and as friends. So because of the Japanese internment, because of Morgan Odell's being influenced and recommended by President Bird, and of course the hiring of Hideo Hashimoto, we have Bill Stafford in Portland, Oregon. Bill, as I said before, had come to this college having attended the University of Kansas, graduated from liberal Kansas from high school. His parents were sort of itinerant in their travels. His father did a lot of things. The family moved from place to place. And Bill would always say the library was always his home. He found refuge there, whether it be in Liberal, Kansas, or some other small town in Kansas, or anywhere his family took him. Upon the war, he declared himself a conscientious objector when he went before the draft board to explain his beliefs that you shouldn't take life. He was asked by one member of the board member, well, where did you learn this? Thou shalt not kill. He goes, well, I learned it from you. You were my scoutmaster. So it was on that that he was given his clearance, and he, of course, traveled again to Arkansas, where, you know, his very first book, Down in My Heart, which is a sort of autobiographical novel about his experience in Arkansas, and also as a conscientious objector in Los Prietos, in Santa Barbara, and also in other places in California. He was teaching in Santa Barbara, in the Inland Empire near San Bernardino in high school, when he was approached by Morgan Odell to attend and come to be a faculty member in the English department at this newly formed Lewis and Clark College here on Palatine Hill. This is a picture from his wife's collection noting Bill's first day on campus. Does anybody recognize the other folks that he has?
Johnson and Duesenberry.
Yes, right.
Wow.
I guess Chuck in the room, all the answers will be correct. So, so it was, yes it is, it's Bob Duesenberry and Kenny Johnson and a student that we don't know who that is. And that, of course, is the old Peebles building behind it, Bill on his first day. As many of you may have known or not know, that this was a very tight community here at Lewis and Clark. Most of these were all new faculty. When the college came from Albany, there were only a few that actually emerged and came through from Albany, Oregon, or that were teaching at the Albany College Extension or campus here in many buildings in Portland that stayed on to this young college. They became quite good friends, this community, not just in the English department, but in the other departments that were in this small college. Of course, Kenny Johnson, here you see Dorothy next to him in the fireplace. The correspondence between Kenny and Bill are probably the most intimate and personal that we have in our collection of the Stafford correspondence. And I say that because they were colleagues for so long, had a warmth and friendship and a kidding nature, and could really be at ease with each other, it seems, from the correspondence that we have. And also the fact that we have both sides of the correspondence. Usually, you know, we have outgoing or incoming in any kind of archives. You don't necessarily have a complete. With Kenny's family giving us his collection, and of course Bill's collection here, we have both the incoming and outgoing for both of them. So you can really see this lifelong correspondence. And as Bill traveled a lot and Kenny traveled a little, they were always corresponding back and forth, gossiping a little bit about what was happening on campus in their department, but also tackling big ideas and big thoughts. And it's probably the most intimate of experience when you look in those letters. All right, Chuck. Who are we looking at here?
Duesenberry.
Right. Bob Duesenberry with Kenny, became a very important person in Bill's life. Depended on him as department chair, depended on him as a friend. Bob was always advocating for, as you can see through the paperwork that we have, for Bill, and Bill likewise, lifelong friends. Outside the department, probably one of their closest, if not closest friends, were of course the Ballmers, Don and Betty. They vacationed together as families. They built homes close to each other in Central Oregon, and they remain and still remain lifelong friends. Those three all still live in the same building now over in Twila River Plaza, and still love and take care of each other as best they can. But Don, of course, in the political science department, came a few years after Bill, of course, but again, the extension of friendship was close, and the families remained close. And I think this is a theme that you see throughout the college, especially from the 40s and 50s, where you see this as a more familial experience on campus. Faculty members vacationing together, not that that doesn't happen now, but as a larger campus and various divisions and departments, it's harder for this young thing to come together. So potlucks, people living close by, friendships that last for years and years and years. The Pauleys, of course, are another very close friends of the Staffords. Connie and Reinhardt, again, still remain to be very close friends, again, extending what I just said. Okay. We're waiting for Chuck for IDs on these.
This is beyond my time.
We have Jerry Baum,
Yeah, Jerry Baum.
Bill Luck, and Kenny Johnson. Again, English department faculty as the department extends, and the breadth becomes more extensive inside departments. You begin to have more specialists, or rather than just teaching survey courses, you have modernists, you have romanticists, you have Victorians. You start to see a larger gamut. As this college grows, so do the departments, and so do the specializations. To the next generation, of course, Susan Kirshner, John Callahan, Jack Hart, and Vernon Ratsala. Because of Bill's continuing work and continuing notoriety, they decided to bring in another poet. This was under the recommendation of Bill. And Donald Justice, who Bill graduated with his PhD from the University of Iowa within the same month and was teaching at Iowa, recommended what he thought was his prize student, Vernon Ratsala, who was also a Portland native, going to Milwaukee High School and Reed for his undergraduate. And Vern became, of course, a longtime member of this faculty, teaching poetry and creative writing. Gus Mattersdorf, again, was Mattersdorf was very close with the Staffords. That's Bruce West, and another longtime colleague in the art department. As the college transitioned from 1960 to around from 1942, 43 to 1960, with Morgan's leaving the college and retiring, and the young 32-year-old Jack Howard, of course, who just unfortunately passed away. You again see the college growing. You see their debt being paid off. You see the buildings start to expand past just what we had at the regular manor house and the extending buildings. You start to see real growth at the college. Jack presiding over this growth from 1960 to 1980. And an important figure also in the development of not just this college expanding forward as a local Northwestern school, but with bigger ideas coming forward and out, whether it be overseas program, whether it be internal building, maybe recruiting from other places. As we get farther away from the GI Bill in World War II, we see more and more time to recruit people into this liberal arts education from various walks of life and from various places. Jack, of course, for 20 years being that component. Stafford becomes an important component of that too. Not just because he's an innovator in the classroom. One of his famous things is no praise, no blame. This from, of course, a syllabi of one of Bill's classes, and I think this is really fitting because if you look through it, you see, the course will be based on a set of texts provided by the college bookstore. Students are encouraged to seek out more and better texts and consult with instructor or other helps, including the library, about extra reading. There's the makeup work and the difficulty. The course is easy, no hazards. Minimum involvement can be very light. At an extreme of involvement, the courses could be a career. Bill was interested in what you could say, not just with your voice, but with your pen. And the more that you could get to that experience in whatever format that it took you to get there was important to Bill. He was, again, famous for no praise and no blame. So get to the art of what you're doing. Create, create, create. As he became more and more popular and needed as a poet on a national stage, it became a juggling act for him to continue to teach full-time and also carry out this his career as a poet across doing workshops, readings, more and more demands on his time. But by the time he came in 1947, he'd already been accepted in Poetry magazine. So by November of 1947, he already had 4 poems in Poetry magazine. So for a young professor and for a young college, it was important to have a faculty member that was receiving national recognition inside of their own field, because we just didn't have that many, because we were either young faculty or faculty that didn't have exactly the exposure from other institutions coming forward to Lewis and Clark. And I think Morgan really saw that as how he shaped this college, was bringing in these young academics that could help to place Lewis and Clark College on the map. We were a brand new school, though we'd been around since 1867. We were brand new on Palatine Hill with a new name, with a new idea, and with a new focus. He also had an extreme dry sense of humor. This was eventually published in Sports Illustrated. Allegedly, this came out of a discussion at a faculty meeting where a couple of unnamed coaches, Joe Houston, were interested in having some ball players be able to kind of work their way quickly through coursework. And this is actually a parody that he wrote, and it's been published. Finally, one coach, a very famous coach, published this in his book about football, and he didn't see it as satirical. He thought this was, a good English faculty member reaching out and extending a hand to the football team to I don't know what, but to be something more than it was. But this is quite funny if you ever had a chance to read this. But he makes up this Coach Musselman, and of course he's asking him to place one of his prize students, who's potentially going to be a Rhodes Scholar, on the football team, and give him playing time, knowing that he doesn't even know anything about football. But it would be important, and that he won't be there all the time because, of course, he has debate team, an English club, and other things to tend to. But, he would be an important asset to have on your team because, well, of course, English faculty think that would be important for him to be on your team. So, the last couple sentences, we expect Paul to show entire goodwill in his work for you. And though he will not be able to begin football practice until late in the season, he will finish the season with good attendance. Like I said, this has been republished many times and all the way into made it into Sports Illustrated. It's not really until the late 50s that Bill published his first book. And it's called West of Your City, and it was published by Robert Greenwood, who was a librarian at San Jose State, what's now San Jose State. And he and a colleague, Newton Baird, were editors of a literary magazine called The Talisman, and of course they started this Talisman Press. And Bill had worked for a year at San Jose State, and he came across Bob in the library, I believe. And they struck up a conversation. He had issued some poems for the Talisman Press, or Talisman Literary Magazine, accepted, and he just had his work rejected by Houghton Mifflin, his what he called put-togethers, which is when he would take a suite of poems that he wrote, he would put in 3-ring punch through them and put brackets in each one of them, and he would submit them as these manuscripts of poems in a book form. He called them put-togethers, and his put-togethers have been rearranged and not been accepted in Indiana and or Houghton Mifflin, and so there was a suggestion by Josephine Miles, another very famous poet and one of Bill's friends, to resubmit the poems in a different way. And during this process, he comes across Bob Greenwood, and he eventually takes this suite of poems and rearranges it and creates West of Your City. He's 43 years old by the time his first book comes out. He's obviously a noted poet. He's been published in all the prestigious literary magazines by this time, but he'd never gotten his first book out. And so it's really in early 1960 that West of Your City comes out for the first time, comes out at all. And it's, of course, what's considered Bill's first book. That same year, he's obviously, the spark that started the flame, because he has a manuscript ready to go, which turns out to be traveling through the dark. And he submits the manuscript again to David Wagoner in Indiana, and he doesn't get a lot of, he gets some correspondence back and forth, but he finds out from a friend who's the Northwest representative for Harper and Row, named Leslie Elliott. Maybe you should submit it to Harper and Row. I know some people there, and in fact, the editor there for poetry was Elizabeth Lawrence. And upon that happening, in Indiana kind of falling through, they take on this older yet new poet, if you will, with only one book under his belt. And he'd been working on a lot of the poems at Yaddo, which was a writer's retreat, and other places, and he put together this suite called Traveling Through the Dark. And it does very well for Harper and Row. It sells 2,500 copies within the second printing. Now that may not seem a lot to you, but in the poetry world, that is huge. That is a lot of books. That's a lot of books. And it's nominated, presented and nominated for the National Book Award. And in 1963, he becomes a finalist for the National Book Award. And I want you just to understand who he was going up against. Some of you, I think, were English majors, and hopefully are lovers of poetry. So some of these names may come through to you. He went up against Donald Drummond's The Drawbridge, Robert Frost's last book, In the Clearing, Kenneth Koch's Thank You and Other Poems, Howard Nemiroff's The Next Room with a Dream, Winifred T. Scott's Collected Poems, Anne Sexton's All My Pretty Ones, William Carlos Williams' Pictures from Bruegel, and he won. So he was against the titans of American poetry. And it was awarded in March 12th, 1963. And to put this in context, again, we're still, really a young institution. And here we have one of our own, if you will, a faculty member from this college, a first time, basically started here as a faculty member, first-time faculty member. I'm now winning the biggest prize there is in the literary world in your field, the National Book Award, against these, like I said, these titans of American poetry. So he was awarded it in March 12, 1963. What's very interesting is that he was given this award by the keynote, which was Robert Oppenheimer. So one who thought of the father of the nuclear bomb is giving the pacifist the National Book Award, which is almost as ironic as Bill Stafford being Richard Nixon's poet laureate. So, so it's quite funny. But I want to just read to you part of his acceptance speech, because I think it really talks about who Bill was. He says, "First I bring thanks from myself and other writers to those whose auspices here sustain us. And my own special thanks I bring to those who have guided us on this bewildering occasion. Further, for those courageous three, the poetry judges, who are perhaps by now suffering one of the recurring twinges of second thought, I bring my admiration and sympathy. May their winsome enthusiasms be forgiven them. Now let me turn to say a word for us poets. For we should have a chance to vaunt or confess. At the moment of writing, when one of those fortunate strokes of composition takes place, the poet does sometimes feel that he is accomplishing an exhilarating, a wonderful, a stupendous job. He glimpses at such times how it might be to be overwhelmed the universe by rightness, to do something peculiarly difficult to such a perfect pitch that something like a revelation comes. For this instance, conceiving is knowing. The secret life in language reveals the very self of things. It is awkward for the poet in our time to own up to such a grandiose feeling, and the feeling may not last long, not make much lasting impression, but it is at the heart of the chore of creating. We may remember mostly the long, stupid look in the material before us, and then maybe a kind of slow, emotional thinking. That is a lonely helplessness feeling. At the time, the writer is responsible for everything, and at the same time, he is simply lost. He has to be willing to stay lost until what he finds, or what he finds him, has a validity for that instance with him as its sole representative and recognized. at the moment he is transported, not because he wants to be, but because he can't help it. Out of the wilderness of possibility comes a vine without a name, and his poem is growing with it. Again, the self-deprecation at the beginning, and then the various layers of depth that is Bill Stafford. This is, of course, from the Pioneer Log. And in 1963, and Paul, the importance and the acceptance speech for the Poetry Award of Bill. I can't underemphasize or overemphasize the magnitude of his accomplishment for this institution. Because it was Bill, and because he won such a big award, many things began to fall into place for this college. It put us on the map, if you will, along with a lot of other people's hard work, but it gave us a national attention and a national voice. And it gave us a voice that I think that we look back to Morgan Odell was trying to do as a pacifist himself, and his first two hires being people that were interned, one for their race and one for their religious convictions. It was a place where we could, people could look to and say, this is something that's happening that is different, but welcoming at the same time. I'm going to turn some time over to talk about life kind of after the National Book Award, and Jeremy's going to talk about that. But I want to make one observation that the poet Donald Hall, who was his friend and another poet laureate of the United States National Book Award winner, said about Bill, and I think it captures really the essence of who Bill was as a writer. It says, Stafford is a poet of ordinary life. His collected poems are the journal of a man recording daily concerns. That is why his daily method of writing is relevant to his life's work. You can say that his poetry is truly quotidian. He writes it every day. It comes out of every day. And the poet of the quotidian did not find it necessary to become modern, to follow Hart Crane to the waterfront, or Valdiere to the whorehouse, or even Lowell to McLean's. He got up at 6 in the morning in a suburb of Portland and drained the sump. That was Bill. Bill was writing for every single person on an everyday basis, and this archives is reflective of that. Every single day of his life, of his adult life, we have a writing in his hand, a poem beginning, a poem finished, a poem incomplete, but there's writing. All from a laying down position with the left hand going downward, gravity dragging the hand to the side, and you can just smell the instant coffee and the burnt toast right next to it. But Bill was a person who represents this college, who is a legacy unto himself, and is a wonderful example of what we all hopefully can become as human beings and as writers. So with that, I'm going to turn some time over to my colleague here, Jeremy Skinner.
So like Doug said, I'm going to talk a little bit about life after the National Book Award, and some months looked a little bit like this. Stafford's schedule got increasingly busy. This page from one of his calendars in the archives shows the month of November 1970, and this one I wouldn't say is representative of every month. This happens to be when he's in Washington, D.C. As poet laureate, but his schedules were busy. This is 1963, the year that he won the National Book Award. He traveled across the country twice, making stops in Washington State, New York, Wisconsin, Indiana, and Iowa. In subsequent years, these long trips would get more frequent. During his travels, Stafford visited universities, bookstores, and galleries, and local clubs to give poetry readings. And since you're here, you really should hear him read. So I'm going to play just a really short poem. This is a poem called In the Night Desert. And the reading itself is from 1966 at Eastern Oregon University. And it's from the book Traveling Through the Dark.
I'd like to end with 2 or 3 more. I like that idea of people being able to keep track. And I know that the want to go on to the next thing, but I'd like to read 2 or 3 more. In the night desert, 3 at most, it's a promise. In the night desert, the Apache word for love twists, then numbs the tongue. Uttered once, clear, said, never that word again. Cousin you call, or sister, and one more word that spins in the dust, a flake chipped like obsidian. The girl who hears this flake and follows you into the dark turns at a touch the night desert forever behind her back.
So in addition to giving readings, Stafford continued to write. During the 1960s, Stafford published about 80 poems per year in magazines and poetry journals. That sometimes more than that. He also had 2 books of poetry published by Harper's. The Rescued Year and Allegiances both received high praise and helped raise Stafford's international profile. This fame led to his appointment as poetry consultant to the Library of Congress. We now know this is the Poet Laureate for the United States. From fall 1970 to spring 1971, Bill, his wife Dorothy, and his daughters Kit and Barbara lived in Northern Virginia while he worked at the Library of Congress. As poetry consultant, he traveled to give readings and teach writing workshops and invited guest readers to the Library of Congress. I really like this photo, and one thing that Doug didn't mention is that the photos that he showed of his colleagues were photos, most of them were photos that he took, and this is also a photo that he took of his secretary at the Library of Congress. And in 1966, he set up a darkroom at his house and really aggressively started taking photos, and we think that part of the reason that he did this was because as he was traveling more and more, he really didn't like the limelight that much. He really preferred to use the camera as a buffer between him and all these people. He'd go to these cocktail parties. He wasn't a big drinker, but he would take his camera and document what was going on. And it's really an amazing part of the collection that we have here, is his documenting of the poetry scene in the United States during the 60s and 70s. So in addition to rubbing shoulders with famous authors like Kurt Vonnegut and Ted Hughes and politicians like Eugene McCarthy, Stafford spent as much time as possible writing while he was at the Library of Congress. The result was the book Someday Maybe, and this book was different than Stafford's previous efforts. Many of the critics considered it to be one of Stafford's weakest efforts, but if you read it as a chronicle of a poet struggling with the politically charged environment in Washington, D.C., it starts to make more sense, and it actually takes on a different life. We had some students actually focusing this last semester on Stafford's time at the Library of Congress, and their discussions about this book were really interesting, and Bill's son Kim sat in on those discussions and was amazed at sort of seeing different aspects of this book that he hadn't really thought of before. So after returning to Portland from Washington, D.C., Stafford resumed teaching at Lewis and Clark, wearing his Lewis and Clark sweatshirt. But demands on his time continued to increase. In particular, Stafford began to spend more time teaching at writing workshops. As Doug mentioned, Stafford had long been committed to fostering creativity through his own teaching, and workshops became an important way for him to model this teaching to other teachers and students. So I'm going to read just a really brief piece. This is an early letter that Stafford wrote to Kenny Johnson, his close friend that Doug mentioned earlier. And in this letter, this is from 1950, Stafford is at the University of Iowa working on his PhD. So he came to Lewis and Clark, he took a leave of absence to work on his PhD, and he's writing back to Kenny about the teaching at the University of Iowa. He says, I find that the teachers of the course differ from our usual selves as discussion leaders. They fire point-blank questions and call on persons by name at random from the roll book. That is, they tag a certain person if no one volunteers at once, or if they are tired of hearing those who volunteer. And the teachers, by keeping the talk always on the topics they choose, manage to accomplish several things. A, they almost always know more than the student. B, they keep the class on edge and worried. The tension is terrific and people leave just limp from strain. C, they manage to assume that the student has the problem of making the teacher see the point instead of assuming, as we often or almost always did, that our job was to see what the student was driving at. This method has its bad and good points, as even I can see. For one thing, it is actually easier for the teacher, I believe, and impresses the class. It makes the students realize that they are in fast intellectual company. They like to compete with each other. On the bad side, in many sessions, the students feel terribly frustrated, for it is not always apparent what the upshot of the talk is. I mean, the teacher may know what the drift of his question is, but he doesn't make his questions have a pattern for the student. And since the teacher decides when to ask a new question, many times the student feels cut off from profitable discussion just when they get to what they feel to be important. So, in some ways, Stafford's fame that came from the National Book Award and from being the Poet Laureate of the United States allowed him to be a leader in teaching potential teachers. And so workshops were the ideal environment for him to do this. Stafford's work during this period also took him beyond the United States on official sponsored trips to Pakistan, India, Iran, and Egypt. And during this time period in the 70s, Lewis and Clark hired another poet, Anthony Ostroff, to split time with Stafford teaching so that Stafford had more time to be an ambassador for the college. And is this the image that we were looking for?
That's not it, but
It's the event.
that's same time.
Same thing, yeah.
In 1974, Stafford was appointed as a poet laureate for Oregon. This image shows President of Lewis and Clark, Jack Howard, on the left, and Governor of Oregon, Tom McCall, to the right of Howard, and then Bill and Dorothy. And Stafford was poet laureate of Oregon from 1974 to 1989. And during that time, again, worked closely with the Oregon Council of Teachers of English in getting improved teaching for creative writing in the classroom.
By the way, that thing on his head is a laurel, what do you call it? Laurel wreath on his head that was given to him by Tom McCall.
So in 1979, Stafford retired from teaching at Lewis and Clark. For the next 14 years, he really focused on his writing even more, believe it or not. His manuscripts in the archives show that his annual output tripled after retirement. Much of this work was passed on to fine press printers and publishers that were issued as beautiful broadsides and little chapbooks. After his death in 1993, the estate, under the direction of Kim Stafford, began to try to find ways to issue some of these writings. But one of the landmark books that came out in 1998 from the estate was The Way It Is, which is really the best of all of his poetry through his whole career, and it also includes some of the last poems that he wrote, including one on the day that he died. And So that's really all I have to say. Since the title of this talk was The Legacy of William Stafford, I just wanted to mention in passing that we have all this material, books, manuscripts, photographs, and it's being used. Just this last fall, we had a class that was based out of the collections. It was called William Stafford Archives, and the focus of that class was really learning methods in writing biography, but in doing so, they were taking a look at all the sources available in the archives for assessing someone's career. We also have used the collections to show the writing process. We have practicum students that work with the materials, and it's an active collection, and we're really glad that we have it. So that's all I have. Thank you.